Pakistan's case, we need to look particularly at these days, the most, I think, obvious example is the question of the Indus River and its historical damming and canal building, which has not just affected the river, but a series of ecologies that are reliant on the main river, its tributaries, the delta regions of Sindh and Balochistan, where you have fishing communities. How do we think about things like glaciers? How do we think about things like forests? But to date, there's no evidence that the people who are in some ways going to be made the sacrificial lambs for these projects are going to get anything out of it. The kind of urbanization that we see in Pakistan today, in fact, I would further say it's usually suburbanization when you talk about these gated housing schemes, is you find a kind of sprawl where cities are expanding into their agrarian hinterlands.
Hello everyone, welcome to DawnNews English. My name is Danish Khan. I'm Assistant Professor of Economics and Political Economy. And today we are going to talk about a wide array of issues facing Pakistan's development and political economy landscape. And to discuss this, I'm delighted to be joined by Professor Asim Sajjad Akhter. He teaches at Quaid-i-Azam University and he's a regular contributor to Dawn's opinion pages. Thank you, Asim, for joining me today.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So I want to start with your recent piece in Dawn where you talk about the Green Pakistan Initiative and you critically analyze it. So I want to start with a more broader question, and that is, how do you conceptualize ecologically sustainable development in the context of a country like Pakistan?
Well, I mean, these are all words that are used very commonly these days: ecology, sustainability, just the very term green, as you noted, this Green Pakistan Initiative. So the buzzwords tend to, sort of imply a lot of things which perhaps are, when you scratch beneath the surface, you find that actually they're a bundle of contradictions. If we really wanted to talk about a sustainable sort of development model in Pakistan, and sustainable both for people and for ecologies, I think we'd have to start primarily by looking at sort of what underlies the sort of logic of economic development in countries like Pakistan. Is it people's welfare? And by that I mean working people's welfare, not just a handful of people, not just investors, not just rich elites, or even state functionaries, the people who make the decisions for us. And then also, are we talking about sort of existing ecologies, which are very vulnerable? Or are we sort of suggesting that if we name something green or put in, as I said at the outset, some buzzwords, then we don't have to worry about that. And I think in Pakistan's case, we need to look particularly at these days, the most, I think, obvious example is the question of the Indus River and its historical damming and canal building, which has not just affected the river, but a series of ecologies that are reliant on the main river, its tributaries, the delta regions of Sindh and Balochistan, where you have fishing communities. So the point is simply to say that I think when we talk about sustainable development, the first thing that we have to think about, and I think the first thing that we have to critically consider, are the existing ecologies and the people who rely on those ecologies. Are they benefiting from that particular mode of development, or are they in fact perhaps, in some cases, being wiped out? And I think that's primarily what I think we would start with. And then we could go from there and think about, well, how do you think beyond that? How do you think of, for instance, the Indus River, again, originates in mountainous highlands. How do we think about things like glaciers? How do we think about things like forests? So I think, we tend to focus on, well, let's have a project and see what kind of, obvious economic outputs does it engender. We don't really think about sort of the long-term costs that those sorts of development models have generated over decades, in fact, sometimes centuries. And I think that is where I would start as a sort of the first and foremost sort of critical perspective that we need to develop.
This is a great point, and it's a good segue into the next question because historically, at least in the 20th century, we saw that development is conceptualized as changing natural landscape, changing indigenous landscape, especially in the colonized spaces. In the case of South Asia, and here we're specifically talking about Pakistan, hydro infrastructural development has been a central theme in the colonial rule. So, in order to contextualize these projects in this long arc of history, can you specify what were some core features of the historical colonial development in Pakistan?
Yeah, well, I mean, again, Pakistan is a series of very different geographies. But let's say the most populated regions of Pakistan, what we call the Indus Basin. Again, the regions primarily what we today's Punjab and Sindh, plain regions that today we assume have always been irrigated through these perennial irrigation systems, were in fact dramatically, as you said, transformed under British rule. And not so long ago, in fact, it was only at the onset of the 20th century, so a little over a century ago, that you saw the development of barrages and canals that totally transformed the natural landscape. So prior to this, what we had was primarily populations existing on riverine belts in and around the main river or its tributaries. But with these big, huge mega water projects and irrigation systems that the British initiated, what you saw was a mass population that was brought in primarily from East Punjab often to irrigate new lands. And the purpose of that was not necessarily to serve, as I said at the outset, the welfare of the people of these regions, but to basically produce cash crops. And alongside that, there were roads and particularly railways built to transport those cash crops to the port cities of India, including in Karachi and Bombay, to then take those cash crops further, which were the raw materials that funded British industrialization. So there's a long history to that. Now, how was this ecology transformed? As I said, first of all, largely pastoral nomadic populations were displaced. This whole project, by the way, was called canal colonization. I mean, I think that goes a long way to telling you what the purpose of it was. So the idea was to colonize these lands, was to create what one of the primary sort of historians of this period, Imran Ali, calls a hydraulic society. So a new society that was powered by these new irrigation networks. And as I said, the purpose was to produce raw materials to ultimately support the British Empire in its war making and its industrialization processes. And the long-term impacts have been, as I suggested earlier, the wasting away of entire ecologies like the delta regions. Today, in lower parts of Sindh, you have virtually no water beyond the Kotri barrage. So that basically means from Hyderabad onwards. So deltas have been destroyed, fishing communities have been wiped out, and even pastoralists, I think, who are a significant, continue to be a significant segment of our rural population. But we think in our popular imaginary, we think rural areas must mean a particular kind of farmer. And of course, peasant farmers are a huge part of the population. And even there, you saw a lot of class differentiation with who these lands were given to, that these new irrigated lands. So this, as you say, a changed landscape based on the mobilization of water and land resources to basically serve the needs of the empire, irrespective of what it meant for local ecologies and local people.
Now, if I put on my development economist hat, and development economists would argue that there's always a trade-off between economic development, especially these infrastructural projects, including hydro projects, and environment and the indigenous population, they have to, or it's inevitable that they have to be displaced. Now, historically, those who were displaced were compensated or resettled. In this project, Green Pakistan initiative? Have locals been consulted, local communities? Let's say, okay, for the national development project, if I use that term, are you willing to sacrifice and how we are going to compensate you or resettle you?
Well, I mean, I think just like as we just noted historically, the question first and foremost is to ask, is there any sort of public interest met
Mhm.
with such projects? It really, even for someone like myself, I cannot understand, or I'm not able to quite come to grips with whose interests or what are the sort of so-called national development goals that are being served here. Because if you think about some of these projects, and just for your listeners' sake, if they don't know, the imaginary that's being put to us is that we are going to transform deserts.
Mhm.
So, for instance, a desert like the Cholistan desert, and we are going to completely change the landscape and make it into this green, lush agricultural zone. Well, first of all, what is going to, as you say, what is going to happen to the people of those regions? But to date, there's no evidence that the people who are in some ways going to be made the sacrificial lambs for these projects are going to get anything out of it. So even in the case where you're saying there's some argument could be made for the transformation of these natural landscapes, the purpose is that ultimately the outcome.
Makes sense. And moving on, another topic on which you regularly write is the urban spaces in Pakistan, especially the development of these gated housing enclaves. And I have written pieces on it as well. Now, and especially as the summer comes in, the heat waves are intense every summer. The issue of smog is getting worse. So tell us about how can we reconceptualize sustainable urban planning in Pakistan, and what are some core shortcomings in the contemporary urban planning regime?
Yeah, as a parallel to what we were just talking about, I mean, if you have sort of imaginaries of colonizing lands and water to serve very dubious or nebulous objectives, in a similar vein, the kind of urbanization that we see in Pakistan today, in fact, I would further say it's usually suburbanization when you talk about these gated housing schemes, is you find a kind of sprawl where cities are expanding into their agrarian hinterlands.
Mm.
So you have basically land that was previously used for agriculture or some kind of, even common, let's say property is being swallowed up in the name of, again, development or real estate development by these big housing schemes, many of whom are, you will find if you actually do some substantive research, are unoccupied. So basically, these are plots that are circulating in these speculative markets. And so it's investors that are buying plots and then selling plots. So no, very few of these schemes are fully occupied. And in that process, as you say, then another additional sort of developmental, in a sense, intervention that serves these housing schemes is this unadulterated building of roads. So you have these highways that are being built from one corner of the city to the other, which is obviously, as you can guess, are basically being used by those who have cars. They are plugging the air with pollution. Um, they, in a sense, serve no other purpose in the urban space than to, in a sense, serve the people who live in these housing schemes, if anyone at all. And then you have plazas and malls and, a whole set of sort of, idealized middle class gated, in a sense, developmental imaginaries. And it's debatable whether, A, as I said, these schemes are actually fully occupied. B, whether they actually serve housing needs as opposed to the needs of investors. And C, in that process, as I noted at the outset, you are facing the displacement of agricultural communities as the city sprawls. Sometimes you face, you have the urban poor who are the sacrificial lambs because slums and squatter settlements are wiped out. And then you have a whole set of, and in fact, then furthermore, you'll see the water table in cities. So, for instance, I'll give you an example of Islamabad. 20 years ago, Islamabad, you could create a bore and you'd find water at 200 feet. Now you can bore down to even 1,000 feet and you won't find
Mhm.
water, because some of these schemes and then road building and then so on and so forth are taking up so much, or are sort of draining the water in urban spaces. So again, like I said, beyond thinking about what could an ecologically sustainable urban development look like, I think the first step is to say what is not sustainable, what is destroying local ecologies, and certainly these real estate developments and incessant road building to service these suburban sort of gated communities is certainly just is not just unsustainable. It's also a kind of class warfare in which, again, you're serving the rich and taking away from the poor.
If we critically analyze Pakistan's history for over 7 decades, uh, one recurring theme is that unsolved national question or ethnic question across Pakistan, especially in the context of Balochistan. Now, and Balochistan has been in the news for all the wrong reasons in the past few weeks and months. So here I want you to think about, like, I want our audience to critically analyze, uh, because in the left-leaning circles there hasn't been discussion about the intersection of identity and class. So and especially Pakistan is in the midst of the global geostrategic game, or the big game as it's called. So how does shifting the scale of analysis from the local, like i.e. the Balochistan, to the national, to Pakistan, to the global, that is the global world capitalist system, change our understanding of these national questions within the context of Pakistan?
Yeah, I don't think we need to change it in as much as, sort of as you suggest, is to think about the different ways in which, at different scales, different sorts of questions and contradictions, or, as we were talking about, developmental regimes generate a series of problems for existing and future generations. And then, let's say the Baloch case, or I was talking about the Indus River in Sindh, or even in Gilgit-Baltistan, you see particular regions, or as you say, ethnic national communities or groups being disproportionately affected by particular kinds of developmental regimes. So if that's happening within a country, like it is in Pakistan, and a lot of that is undergirded, as you say, by the grabs of water and minerals and resources, then that's also happening at the global level, right? It's not like these are things that are limited to particular geographies. There is a larger developmental story if you extrapolate from a particular case, like a Baloch case or the Sindhi case or the Gilgit-Baltistani case, to the world at large. We see, minerals and resources and water, and forest grabs all over the world. And that is an ecological crisis. That is a crisis of class. And that, as you say, then also exacerbates or heightens this sense of particular identities or groups or national groups that come to perceive, and I think rightfully so, that their resources are being taken from them by, it could be a particularly centralized state, as is the case in Pakistan.
Now, Nancy Fraser, in her work, distinguish or creates that dualism between politics of recognition versus politics of redistribution. Whereas the politics of recognition is about identity, and where politics of redistribution is primarily about the class. Now, it seems like the progressive politics in Pakistan tends to be centered around politics of recognition. Would you agree with this assessment? And second, if there's a working class person in Punjab, how can we connect a progressive project, especially through political mobilization, where the working class of Punjab, Balochistan, GB, Sindh, KP, as you named all these spaces, can see what is common in terms of their interests rather than further fragmenting these working classes?
In Pakistan's case, I would say that, when you think about, like, say, for instance, we were talking about the national question or ethnic national mobilizations. Sure, on the surface, these are largely questions of identity. But they're also, as we talked about, questions about resources. They're also about, resources like land and water and minerals, and the question of who gets to use those and access those resources. So it's not just I want to speak my language and I want to have representation within the system, but I want to have access to those resources. And it's true that even within a particular ethnic national community, that access to those resources is disaggregated by class or by which segment of that particular ethnic national community is represented in the state, and large segments are not. So yes, that requires, or that would mean that you are able to, you do articulate a politics in which you say, well, in every, even in privileged, relatively privileged regions like in Punjab, there are large segments of the population that do not get the benefits of development, right? Based on, like, for instance, we're talking about in urban areas, poor farmers or squatters. But I think it's important to understand that, when you have situations where you have, for instance, if we go back to where we started, where the dominant question of politics tends to be thought of as a question of colonization, then it's not surprising that you would see the emergence of a kind of politics where you feel like, well, there's an entire population that is colonizing me.
So my question to you, as you're one of the leading critical thinkers on the post-colonial state of Pakistan, how can we explain the inability of the post-colonial state of Pakistan to at least even do these bare minimum, and i.e. the recognize or at least try to resolve that identity or this ethnic national question, at least on the level of recognition?
Well, I mean, it depends whether you think of this as a success or a failure. I mean, yes, it's a failure insofar as, as you say, national questions remain so heightened, and this sense of being alienated, like in the Baloch case, is so acute. But I think the fundamental problem is that you do have different ethnic linguistic communities. If you don't recognize them, and then on top of that, you don't acknowledge their rights to their own resources, then these problems will never go away. In fact, with time, they will just become more and more acute, as we're seeing.
Thank you, Asim, for your time. It was wonderful talking with you. And thank you to our viewers for tuning in. Until next time, this is Danish Khan signing off.